Margaret clutched her worn leather suitcase with trembling fingers as the train pulled into Cedar Creek Station. The small Wyoming town looked nothing like the bustling streets of Boston she had left behind 3 weeks ago. Dust swirled around her ankles as she stepped onto the wooden platform, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had answered Samuel Hayes' advertisement in the Boston Herald almost by accident. While cleaning Mrs. Henderson's parlor where she worked as a housemaid, she had found the newspaper folded to the matrimonial section. Widowed rancher seeks gentle wife to care for young daughter and share prairie life. Must be kind and willing to learn ranch ways. Something about those simple words had stirred something deep inside her chest. Margaret had never been the bold type. Born to Irish immigrants who died when she was 15, she had spent the last 8 years working for wealthy families, always keeping her head down and her voice quiet. The other housemaids called her Mouse because she moved so silently through the halls. But there was a longing in her heart for something more than scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. The correspondence with Samuel had been brief, but encouraging. He wrote in careful, honest words about his ranch, his 6-year-old daughter Emma who had been without a mother for 2 years, and his hope for a peaceful partnership. Margaret had sent her only photograph, the one taken at the church social where she looked almost pretty in her Sunday dress, though her eyes still held that frightened look she could never quite shake. Now, standing on the platform with her few belongings, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The other passengers quickly disappeared into waiting wagons or walked toward the town's main street, leaving her alone under the vast Montana sky. The silence was overwhelming after years of city noise. "Miss O'Brien?" A deep voice made her jump. She turned to see a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind brown eyes approaching her. His hat was in his hands, revealing dark hair streaked with early silver despite his apparent youth. "I'm Samuel Hayes." Margaret's voice caught in her throat. She had imagined him older, perhaps stern-faced like the men who employed her in Boston. Instead, Samuel Hayes looked tired but gentle, with worry lines around his eyes that spoke of responsibility and loss. "Yes, sir. I'm Margaret. Welcome to Cedar Creek." He reached for her suitcase, and she noticed his hands were calloused but clean. "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "It was long," she managed, her Irish accent still noticeable despite years of trying to soften it. "But I'm grateful to be here." Samuel loaded her belongings into a sturdy wagon, then helped her climb onto the wooden seat. As they rolled through the town, he pointed out the general store, the church, and the small schoolhouse where Emma would start attending in the fall. Margaret nodded and tried to memorize everything, but her attention kept drifting to the endless expanse of prairie stretching in all directions. "It's bigger than I expected," she said softly. "The land." Samuel glanced 3 weeks after Margaret's arrival at the Hayes Ranch. The real test of her transformation came in the form of an unexpected crisis. Samuel had ridden out early to check on cattle in the far pasture when a violent summer storm rolled across the prairie with frightening speed. What had begun as a beautiful morning dissolved into howling wind and driving rain that sent the animals into panic. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the dark clouds swirl overhead while Emma played quietly with her dolls on the parlor floor. The little girl seemed unconcerned by the weather, but Margaret felt a growing unease as the wind began to rattle the windows and the first fat raindrops splattered against the glass. "Miss Margaret, why do you look worried?" Emma asked, appearing at her elbow with her favorite doll tucked under her arm. "Just watching the storm, sweetheart. Your papa should have taken shelter by now." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Margaret's anxiety grew. She had lived through plenty of thunderstorms in Boston, but nothing quite like this. The wind seemed to have a voice here on the open prairie, howling around the house with an intensity that made the sturdy log walls creak. When the rain began in earnest, it came not as a gentle shower, but as a torrential downpour that turned the ranch yard into a muddy lake within minutes. Margaret could barely see the barn through the sheets of water cascading from the sky. Then, Emma noticed what Margaret had missed. "Miss Margaret, the chickens." Margaret turned to see the hen house door swinging wildly in the wind. It must have blown open, and now the chickens were scattered across the yard, squawking in terror as they tried to find shelter. Without their coop, They would be vulnerable to predators, and several of them were Margaret's particular favorites. The gentle brown hens that laid the best eggs and always came running when she called. "Oh no," Margaret breathed, watching Henrietta, the sweet-natured hen who always perched on her shoulder, flapping desperately near the garden fence. "Papa says the chickens are important," Emma said with 6-year-old seriousness. "We need them for eggs and sometimes for Sunday dinner. Are they going to be okay?" Margaret looked at the storm raging outside, then at Emma's trusting face. The old Margaret would have wrung her hands and waited helplessly for Samuel to return. But something had changed inside her during these weeks at the ranch. These weren't just any chickens. They were her chickens now, part of the life she was building, part of the responsibility she had accepted when she chose to stay. "Get my shawl from the peg by the door," she told Emma, surprised by the decisiveness in her own voice. "And put on your rain boots. We're going to save our chickens." "Really?" Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. "But it's raining so hard." "That's exactly why they need our help," Margaret said, tying her bonnet securely under her chin. "They're counting on us." What followed was 15 minutes of the most exhilarating terror Margaret had ever experienced. Wrapped in her heavy shawl and fighting against wind that threatened to knock her off her feet, she splashed through the muddy yard while Emma cheered her on from the covered porch. One by one, Margaret coaxed the frightened chickens back to safety, speaking to them in the gentle voice they knew, offering handfuls of grain she had grabbed from the feed bin. The wind tried to steal her bonnet. The rain soaked through her skirts despite the shawl, and twice she nearly slipped in the treacherous mud. But each time she successfully guided another hen to safety, she felt a surge of fierce satisfaction. When Henrietta finally allowed herself to be caught and carried to the coop, Margaret felt triumphant despite being thoroughly drenched. By the time she had secured all the chickens and latched the henhouse door properly, she was muddy from head to toe and shivering with cold. But as she stood in the doorway of the coop, listening to the birds settling down and clucking softly to each other, Margaret realized something profound had happened. She was no longer afraid. Not of the storm, not of taking charge, not of making decisions that mattered to the family she was building. The shy housemaid who had hidden behind other people's expectations was gone, replaced by a woman who would wade into a storm to protect what was hers. "Miss Margaret! Miss Margaret!" Emma was jumping up and down on the porch, clapping her hands. "You saved them all. You're so brave." Brave. Margaret had never thought of herself that way. But as she ran through the rain back to the house, she felt the truth of it settling into her bones. She was brave. Maybe she always had been. Maybe it had just taken the right circumstances to bring it out. Inside, as she changed into dry clothes and Emma helped her towel her hair, the little girl chattered excitedly about the rescue mission. "Wait until Papa hears. You were like a hero in one of his stories, fighting the storm to save everyone." When Samuel finally returned an hour later, having taken shelter in the old line shack until the worst of the storm passed, he found his house filled with the warm smell of fresh bread and the sound of feminine laughter. Margaret and Emma were in the kitchen, flour dusting their hands as they worked together to prepare supper. "Papa!" Emma launched herself into his arms before he was fully through the door. Miss Margaret was so brave. She saved all the chickens from the storm, even though the wind was trying to blow her away. She got all muddy and wet, but she didn't care because she said they were counting on us. Samuel looked over Emma's head at Margaret, who was blushing and trying to downplay the incident. But he could see something different in her posture, something new in the way she met his eyes directly instead of glancing away. "Is that so?" he said seriously to Emma, though his eyes never left Margaret's face. "She rescued all our chickens? Every single one. Even Henrietta, and you know how she likes to hide." Miss Margaret talked to them all sweet-like, and they came right to her, just like they do for you. That evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed with extra stories about brave women who faced down storms, Samuel and Margaret sat on the porch in the fresh, rain-washed air. The crisis had passed, but its effects lingered in the changed atmosphere between them. "Emma's right," Samuel said quietly. "What you did today was brave. Most women would have waited for me to come back. I couldn't just watch them suffer," Margaret replied. "They're mine now, aren't they? Part of my responsibility." "Yes," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. They are. This whole place is, if you want it to be. The conversation that followed was the most honest they had yet shared. Samuel spoke about his fears for Emma's future, his worries about being both father and mother to a growing girl. Margaret found herself talking about her dreams for the ranch, ideas she hadn't even realized she had been forming about expanding the vegetable garden, maybe getting some dairy cows, teaching Emma to read and write properly. You've changed, Samuel observed as the moon rose over the prairie. Since you've been here, I mean. You're more yourself, somehow. Margaret considered this. I think I'm becoming who I was meant to be all along. I just never had the chance before. And what about us? Samuel asked carefully. What we talked about the other night, about making this permanent. Do you still feel the same way? Margaret looked at this good man who had given her a new life. Then, thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in her little bed, trusting that the adults in her world would keep her safe and loved. She thought about the chickens she had rescued, the garden flourishing under her care, the community in Cedar Creek that had welcomed her with open arms. I'd like us to be married properly, she said. Not just a convenient arrangement, but a real marriage, a real family. Samuel's smile could have lit up the entire prairie. Emma's been asking when she can call you Mama. Should I tell her soon? Very soon, Margaret agreed, her heart full to bursting. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the little white church where Margaret had first felt accepted by the community. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Coleman had helped her alter, with wildflowers in her hair that Emma had insisted on picking herself. But the most meaningful moment came not during the ceremony, but afterward, as the three of them stood together receiving congratulations from their friends and neighbors. Emma, resplendent in her best blue dress with ribbons in her golden curls, tugged on Margaret's skirt to get her attention. What is it, sweetheart? Margaret bent down to Emma's level. Can I call you Mama now? Emma asked, her voice suddenly shy. Really and truly, Mama? Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she gathered Emma into her arms. Yes, darling. Really and truly. Mama, Emma whispered, testing out the word. Then, louder, with growing confidence. Mama. Everyone, this is my Mama. As the small crowd of well-wishers laughed and applauded, Margaret felt the final piece of her transformation click into place. She was no longer the frightened mail-order bride who had stepped off the train just 2 months ago. She was Margaret Hayes, wife and mother, a woman who had found her courage and her place in the world. That night, as she and Samuel sat on their porch now, truly theirs, watching Emma chase fireflies in the yard with the neighborhood children, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the advertisement in the Boston Herald that had seemed like such a desperate chance, the terrifying train ride into the unknown, those first nervous days when everything was strange and new. Any regrets? Samuel asked softly, following her gaze to where Emma was laughing with pure joy. Only one, Margaret replied. I wish I had been brave enough to answer your advertisement sooner. Samuel reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. We all needed to be ready for each other. As if summoned by their conversation, Emma came running up to the porch, breathless and glowing with happiness. Mama, did you see? I caught 3 fireflies. And Tommy Anderson says they're good luck if you make a wish before you let them go. What did you wish for? Margaret asked, smoothing Emma's tousled hair. Emma grinned at her. Yes, it takes some getting used to. When I first came here from Ohio, I felt lost for months. But there's a peace to it, once you find your place. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the wagon wheels creating a steady rhythm on the dirt road. Margaret found herself stealing glances at her future husband. He seemed patient and thoughtful, not rushing to fill the silence with empty chatter. When a jackrabbit darted across their path, he slowed the horses gently rather than cursing like the men she had known in the city. Tell me about Emma. The first week at the Hayes Ranch passed like a dream for Margaret. Each morning, she woke to Emma's gentle knocking on her door, followed by the little girl's excited whispers about the adventures planned for the day. Samuel proved to be a patient teacher, showing Margaret how to milk the cows, collect eggs, and tend to the vegetable garden that had been neglected since his wife's death. Margaret discovered she had a natural touch with growing things. Under her careful attention, The drooping bean plants straightened, the tomatoes began to flourish, and the herb garden came back to life. Emma watched everything with wide-eyed fascination, chattering about how Miss Margaret has magic hands, just like Mama used to. But it was the evenings that Margaret treasured most. After supper, the three of them would sit on the front porch while Emma played with her dolls or showed off her newest rock finds. Samuel would whittle small animals from scraps of wood, his hands steady and sure as he carved. Margaret learned to mend and darn by the fading light, feeling useful in a way she never had in her previous positions. "You're settling in well," Samuel observed one evening as they watched Emma chase fireflies in the yard. "The house already feels more lived in." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "Little things. The way you've arranged the kitchen makes more sense than how I had it. The curtains hang straight now." Emma laughs more. He paused in his carving. "She's been humming again. She used to do that all the time before Sarah died. I'd forgotten how much I missed that sound." The mention of his first wife created a moment of awkward silence. Margaret had been wondering when Sarah's memory would surface in conversation. She had seen the small portrait on the mantelpiece, a beautiful woman with Emma's golden hair and bright smile. "She was very lovely," Margaret said quietly. "She was." Samuel's voice held no sadness now, just gentle remembrance. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said the best people are the ones who notice the small kindnesses." "What do you mean?" "The way you saved extra scraps for the barn cats. How you let Emma help with everything, even when it slows you down. The way you've been teaching her to braid her hair properly instead of just managing it yourself." He smiled. Sarah believed that character shows in how we treat the powerless. Animals, children, people who can't do anything for us in return. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. She had never thought of her actions as particularly kind. They just felt natural. But seeing them through Samuel's eyes made her realize she might be more capable than she had ever believed. The real test came on Sunday, when Samuel announced they would be attending church in town. Margaret's stomach knotted with familiar anxiety. Meeting new people, being stared at and judged, facing the inevitable questions about her background. All of it made her want to hide in her room. "Do I have to go?" she asked quietly, immediately feeling foolish for the question. Samuel studied her face with those kind brown eyes. "The whole town knows I went to fetch a mail-order bride. If you don't come to church, they'll assume something's wrong between us. But if you're not ready." Emma looked up from where she was brushing her doll's hair. "Everyone will love Miss Margaret, Papa. Mrs. Coleman said she seems very nice, and Mrs. Patterson at the general store said she has a sweet face." "They've been talking about me?" Margaret's anxiety spiked. "Only good things," Samuel assured her. Cedar Creek is a small town. When something new happens, people notice. But they're good people mostly. They want to welcome you. Margaret spent extra time on her appearance that morning, wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton with tiny white flowers, and pinning her auburn hair into a neat bun. Emma declared her beautiful as a princess and insisted on carrying Margaret's Bible for her. The church was smaller than the grand cathedral Margaret had attended in Boston, but the white wooden building with its modest steeple had a welcoming warmth. As they climbed the front steps, Margaret could feel curious eyes upon her, but Samuel's steady presence beside her and Emma's small hand in hers gave her courage. Inside, the sanctuary buzzed with quiet conversations that stopped as they entered. Margaret felt her cheeks burn under the scrutiny, but then a plump woman with graying hair approached them with a warm smile. "You must be Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Ruth Coleman. I've been watching Emma while Samuel was courting you by mail. Welcome to Cedar Creek." Other introductions followed quickly. The schoolteacher, Miss Anderson, was eager to discuss Emma's education. The banker's wife, Mrs. Patterson, complimented Margaret's dress and asked about her journey west. The blacksmith's family, the Andersons, welcomed her with genuine warmth. But it was during the church service itself that Margaret experienced something unexpected. As the small congregation sang hymns in voices that ranged from beautiful to enthusiastic but off-key, she felt a sense of belonging she had never known. In Boston, she had sat in the servants' section, invisible and separate. Here, she sat between Samuel and Emma in a proper pew, accepted as part of the community. When Reverend Morrison asked the congregation to welcome their newest member, Margaret found herself standing as applause filled the small sanctuary. Emma beamed beside her, clearly proud to be showing off her new mama-to-be. After the service, several women approached Margaret with invitations to quilting circles, church socials, and informal gatherings. Mrs. Coleman pressed a jar of homemade preserves into her hands, and the doctor's wife offered to share her prized rose cuttings. "See," Emma whispered as they walked back to the wagon. "I told you everyone would love you." But the real moment of truth came that afternoon when Emma fell while exploring near the creek. She had been showing Margaret her favorite fishing spot when she slipped on the muddy bank, scraping her knee and bruising her elbow. The tears that followed were more from fright than pain, but they were genuine and heartbreaking. Without thinking, Margaret gathered the little girl into her arms, soothing her with gentle words and careful examination of her injuries. She carried Emma back to the house, cleaned her scrapes with tender efficiency, and applied bandages while humming softly under her breath. "Does it hurt very much, sweetheart?" she asked, smoothing Emma's tangled hair. "A little, but it feels better when you pet my hair like that." Emma sniffled and looked up at Margaret with trusting eyes. "Mama used to do that when I was sad." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Not the comparison to Sarah, which might have felt threatening, but the simple trust in Emma's voice. This child was looking to her for comfort, believing that Margaret could take away her pain and make everything right. "Would you like me to tell you a story while you rest?" Margaret offered. "Yes, please. Tell me about when you were little." So Margaret found herself sharing memories she had never spoken aloud. Tales of her childhood in Ireland before her family came to America, stories of her mother's flower garden, and her father's beautiful singing voice. Emma listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions or making connections to her own experiences. Samuel found them there an hour later. Emma curled against Margaret's side while listening to a story about fairy rings in Irish meadows. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unnoticed, and Margaret caught a glimpse of something profound in his expression: relief, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. That evening, after Emma was settled in bed with extra kisses and reassurances, Margaret and Samuel sat longer on the porch than usual. The conversation flowed more easily than before, covering everything from their childhoods to their hopes for Emma's future. "She's never taken to anyone so quickly," Samuel said. "Even with the neighbor women who've helped care for her, she's always held something back. But with you," he shook his head in wonder. "She makes it easy," Margaret replied. "She has such an open heart. That's Sarah's influence. She believed children should be raised with love and security so they could trust the world." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I've been worried about whether I was giving her enough affection. Men aren't always. Well, I wasn't sure I was enough." "You're a wonderful father," Margaret said with conviction. "She adores you. The way her whole face lights up when you come in from the fields, how she saves her best stories to tell you at supper. She feels completely secure in your love." Samuel looked at her with surprise. "You really see that?" "Of course. It's obvious to anyone watching." Margaret realized this was the longest conversation they had ever had, and she was no longer nervous. Somewhere in the space between Emma's scraped knee and this moment, she had stopped feeling like a stranger in this house. "Margaret," Samuel said carefully, "I hope you know that this arrangement doesn't have to remain temporary. If you're happy here, if you think we could build a real partnership, I'd be honored to make our marriage official." Margaret's heart skipped. She looked out over the moonlit prairie, thinking about her life before, the loneliness, the constant fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, the exhausting effort of staying invisible. Then, she thought about Emma's trusting embrace that afternoon, the warmth of the church community, the satisfaction of making this house into a real home. "I think I'd like that," she said quietly. Samuel's smile was brilliant even in the moonlight. "Emma will be over the moon. She's been asking when she can start calling you Mama instead of Miss Margaret." "She can call me whatever feels right to her," Margaret said. "I don't want to replace Sarah's memory." "You're not replacing anything," Samuel assured her. "You're adding something new, something we both need." Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she reflected on how much had changed in just 1 week. The shy, frightened woman who had stepped off the train was still there, but She was discovering strength she never knew she possessed. In caring for Emma, in making this house a home, in finding her place in the Cedar Creek community, she was becoming someone new. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Margaret." Emma's voice was small and hesitant. Margaret opened the door to find the little girl in her nightgown, clutching her favorite doll. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I had a bad dream. Mama used to let me sleep with her when I was scared." Emma's lower lip trembled. "But I know you're not really my mama yet. So maybe." Margaret's heart melted completely. She lifted Emma into her arms and settled them both on the bed, the little girl curling trustingly against her side. "I may not be your real mama yet," Margaret whispered, "but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. You're safe." Emma sighed contentedly. "I'm glad Papa picked you," she murmured as sleep began to claim her. "You give the best hugs." As she held the sleeping child, Margaret finally understood what Samuel had meant about finding her place. She had spent years feeling like she didn't quite fit anywhere, always on the edges of other people's lives. But here, in this small room on this prairie ranch, holding this precious little girl, she finally felt complete. The transformation wasn't finished yet. There would be more challenges, more lessons to learn, more courage to find. But as she drifted off to sleep with Emma warm and safe in her arms, Margaret O'Brien knew she was exactly where she belonged, Erit said, surprising herself with her boldness. Samuel's expression softened immediately. "She's bright as a new penny, that one. Curious about everything. She's been helping me with the chickens and has her own little garden patch." He paused, his hands tightening slightly on the reins. "She doesn't remember her mother much, but she asks questions. I've tried to be both parents, but..." He trailed off. "But a child needs a woman's touch," Margaret finished gently. "I understand. She's been staying with Mrs. Coleman in town while I came to fetch you. She was so excited about meeting you that she barely slept last night." Samuel smiled, but Margaret caught the worry in his voice. "I hope you'll both find what you're looking for." The Hayes Ranch appeared gradually over a small rise, and Margaret's breath caught. The house was larger than she had expected, built of sturdy logs with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. A red barn stood nearby, surrounded by corrals where horses grazed peacefully. Chickens pecked in the yard, and she could see a vegetable garden stretching behind the house. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. My first wife, Sarah, she designed the flower boxes. I've tried to keep them going, but I'm afraid I don't have her touch with growing things." Samuel's voice was matter-of-fact, but Margaret heard the lingering sadness. As they pulled up to the house, the front door burst open, and a small tornado of energy came flying down the porch steps. Emma Hayes was all golden curls and bright blue eyes, wearing a blue gingham dress that had seen better days and boots that were clearly meant for outdoor adventures. Papa, is this her? Is this my new mama?" Emma stopped just short of the wagon, suddenly, shy as she looked up at Margaret. Margaret's heart clenched. The little girl was beautiful, but there was something in her eager expression that spoke of longing and hope that was almost too much to bear. Here was a child who had been without a mother's love for 2 precious years, who was now looking at a complete stranger with desperate trust. "This is Miss O'Brien, Emma," Samuel said gently as he helped Margaret down from the wagon. "Remember what we talked about? She's come to be my wife, and we'll see how everything goes." But Emma wasn't listening to the careful explanations. She stepped closer to Margaret, tilting her head like a curious bird. "You're very pretty," she announced. "And you have sad eyes like Papa sometimes gets." "Are you sad?" Margaret knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level, her shyness forgotten in the face of the child's direct question. "A little," she admitted. "But I think I might be happy here, if you'll help me learn how to be a ranch woman." Emma's face lit up like sunrise. "Oh, I can teach you lots of things. I know where all the best eggs are hidden, and how to make the horses come when you whistle, and where the creek has the smoothest stones for skipping. And I can show you Mama's flower garden, though it's all weedy now because Papa says he has brown thumbs instead of green ones." "I'd like that very much," Margaret said, and found she truly meant it. There was something about this earnest little girl that called to every protective instinct she possessed. Samuel watched the exchange with visible relief. Why don't we get Miss O'Brien settled in the house? She's had a long journey. The inside of the house was clean but clearly lacked a woman's organizational touch. The kitchen was spacious with a large wood stove and plenty of counter space, but the curtains were crooked and there were dishes stacked haphazardly in the cupboards. The parlor held comfortable furniture arranged practically rather than for beauty, and Margaret could see dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight. I've prepared the spare room for you, Samuel said, carrying her suitcase down a short hallway. I thought we should take time to get to know each other properly before we make any permanent arrangements. Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but she was grateful for his consideration. That's very thoughtful. The spare room was small but cheerful, with a window that looked out over the vegetable garden. A handmade quilt covered the simple bed, and wildflowers in a mason jar sat on the small dresser. It was more welcoming than any room she had ever called her own. Emma picked the flowers, Samuel said quietly. She wanted everything to be perfect for you. That evening, they shared a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. Emma chattered constantly, telling Margaret about every animal on the ranch, her favorite hiding places, and her grand plans for expanding her garden. Samuel listened with obvious affection, occasionally adding details or gently correcting an exaggeration. And this is my special rock collection, Emma announced, producing a cigar box filled with ordinary-looking stones. To her, each one was a treasure with its own story. This one looks like a horse, and this one is almost perfectly round, and this blue one I found by the creek after the big storm last month. Margaret examined each stone with the seriousness it deserved, asking questions and admiring Emma's finds. She noticed Samuel watching them with something that might have been hope in his eyes. Later, as Emma reluctantly prepared for bed, she turned to Margaret with sudden shyness returning. Will you still be here in the morning? Yes, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. Promise. Margaret looked at this trusting little face and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. I promise. After Emma was tucked into her small bedroom across the hall, Margaret and Samuel sat on the front porch in the gathering twilight. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the distant sound of cattle and the evening songs of crickets. She likes you, Samuel said eventually. She's wonderful. You've done a good job with her. I've done my best, but she needs more than I can give her. She needs a mother. He was quiet for a moment. I know this arrangement is unusual. We're strangers, really. But I hope we can build something good together, for her sake, if nothing else. Margaret thought about her life in Boston, the endless days of scrubbing and serving, the loneliness that had followed her like a shadow. Then she looked at this peaceful ranch, this kind man, this precious little girl who had already claimed a piece of her heart. I hope so too, she said softly. That night, lying in her new bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in years. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like she might have found a place where she could stop running and start living. She thought about Emma's eager question about becoming her mama, and the trust in those bright blue eyes. Could she really become the mother this child needed? Could she overcome her own fears and shyness to build a family with these strangers who had welcomed her so warmly? Outside her window, a coyote howled in the distance, and Margaret shivered slightly. The prairie was vast and wild, so different from everything she had known. But perhaps that was exactly what she needed, a place big enough for her to find out who she really could be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons to learn about ranch life, and about being part of a family. But tonight, for the first time in years, Margaret O'Brien fell asleep feeling like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The moon rose high over the Hayes Ranch, casting silver light across the prairie grass, and illuminating the small house, where three souls were beginning to discover that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to exactly the right destination.